The sharp clang of metal on concrete echoed in the garage that morning, a familiar sound that mixed with the steady hum of an air compressor and the thick, pungent scent of engine oil. But beneath the surface of that ordinary chaos, an invisible current was shifting. A single moment was brewing that would ripple through several lives, changing their course forever. Malik, his young face etched with a tiredness that went beyond his years, bent over the open hood of an old sedan. His hands, though skilled and steady, were smeared with a day's worth of grease before the sun had even fully risen. He wasn't supposed to be here this early, but a promise he had made to himself was stronger than any schedule. No customer, he had vowed, would ever leave this place feeling helpless, especially not someone who carried the same fragile grace as his late mother. And when the frail, elderly woman had arrived, her hands trembling on the steering wheel of a car that refused to start, he didn't see just another job. He saw a human being trapped in a moment of quiet desperation. Malik had been turning wrenches at Redline Auto Repairs for barely 6 months. He was only 22, but life had forced him to grow up fast. His father, a factory worker with a warm laugh and calloused hands, had been taken from them too soon in a workplace accident, leaving Malik as the sole provider for his younger sister. Money was a constant pressing weight, and his boss, Mr. Harlan, never let him forget it. Harlan was a man forged in the old school of mechanics, strict and seasoned, with little patience for anything that didn't contribute to the bottom line. He constantly reminded Malik that kindness didn't pay the bills. Malik never argued back. He couldn't afford to. This job was the thin line between survival and ruin. But deep inside, a persistent voice whispered that helping others mattered more than profit, that some things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. That morning, as the elderly woman, Mrs. Green, stood beside her broken-down car, anxiety was written in the deep lines around her eyes. She explained in a soft, wavering voice that her car had given up on her way to the pharmacy. She confessed with a touch of shame that she couldn't possibly afford any repairs until her small pension check arrived next week. A familiar ache tugged at Malik's heart. He knew that look of helplessness all too well. He offered her a soft, reassuring smile. "Let me just take a quick look," he said gently, his tone meant to soothe her frayed nerves. It didn't matter to him whether she could pay. He understood the profound loneliness of being stranded with no one willing to lend a hand. He quickly diagnosed the issue, a small, faulty part that had finally given out. He replaced it with a spare from his personal toolbox, patched a minor leak he noticed, and then, seeing her fuel gauge on empty, he poured the last of the gasoline from his own canister into her tank. When he turned the key, the engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared back to life with a steady hum. Mrs. Green's eyes, pale and clouded with worry just moments before, welled up with tears of pure relief. She fumbled in her purse and tried to press her last few crumpled dollars into his hand, but he gently shook his head, closing his greasy fingers over hers for a brief moment. "Just drive safe, ma'am," he whispered, stepping back and waving her on her way. He felt a quiet warmth spread through his chest, a feeling worth more than any payment. What he didn't know was that this entire act of compassion had been seen. His boss had been watching from the office window, his expression growing darker with every passing second. Later that afternoon, the storm broke. Mr. Harlan stormed into the workshop, his face a thunderous mask of fury. His voice, sharp enough to cut through the din of machinery, sliced through the air. The two younger apprentices froze in place, their wrenches hanging uselessly in their hands. Malik stood his ground as Mr. Harlan stopped in front of him, his finger jabbing accusingly toward Malik's chest, the veins on his forehead pulsing with rage. "You think this is a charity?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You think we can run a business on pity and free handouts?" The words stung, but Malik remained silent, knowing that any explanation would only fuel the fire. He tried to speak to explain the woman's situation, but Harlan wasn't listening. The confrontation escalated, Harlan's voice growing louder and more venomous until, in a final explosive burst of anger, he shouted the words that made the whole garage fall silent. "You're fired. Get out." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The two apprentices stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Malik stood frozen, a cold dread washing over him. Tears burned at the back of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. At that very moment, Mrs. Green, having returned with a small plate of homemade cookies as a thank you, stood near the wide-open bay door. She watched, both hands covering her mouth in horror, as the kind young man who had saved her morning lost everything because of it. Her heart shattered in that instant. With a heavy sigh, Malik quietly pulled off his work gloves, placed them carefully on the bench that had been his station, and walked out of Redline Auto Repairs without another word. The following days bled into nights filled with a gnawing uncertainty. Malik walked miles, searching for work at every garage and repair shop in the city, but he was turned away time and again. Without a reference from his last employer, no one was willing to take a chance on him. The small amount of money he had painstakingly saved dwindled with frightening speed. His sister, unaware of what had transpired, would ask why he seemed so quiet and worried. He would force a smile and tell her everything was fine, but the lie felt like a heavy stone in his gut. His dream of one day opening his own small, honest repair shop felt like it was dissolving into dust. Meanwhile, a strange coldness had settled over Redline Auto Repairs. The other mechanics felt Malik's absence like a missing tool. The mornings were quieter. The easy laughter and sense of teamwork he had fostered were gone. Customers who had come to trust Malik's honest assessments and fair prices began to notice the change too. Complaints started to trickle in, and some long-time regulars stopped coming back altogether. The real turning point, however, came 3 days after Malik was fired. Mr. Harlan received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Green, leaning on her cane, her soft lavender cardigan buttoned neatly, walked slowly but with a determined look in her tired eyes. She approached the boss's desk, her voice trembling but clear as she explained who she was. She told him about the car, but more importantly, she told him where she had been going that day. She had been on her way to the hospital to visit her sick grandson. Without Malik's help, without his selfless act of fixing her car for free, she wouldn't have made it in time. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks as she recounted how that young mechanic's generosity had allowed her to be there, to hold her grandson's hand and say her final goodbye before he passed away peacefully that evening. "He didn't just fix a car, sir," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He gave me a final moment with someone I loved. He gave me a gift I can never ever repay." For the first time in many years, Mr. Harlan's stern, impenetrable demeanor cracked. The hardness in his face softened, replaced by a look of stunned realization. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. The full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. The image of himself shouting at the young man, his face twisted in anger, replayed in his mind. That night, sleep offered him no escape. He thought of his own son, lost in a tragic road accident years ago, and how he had poured all his energy into building this business as a way to numb the grief. He had walled off his heart, believing that strict discipline and rigid control were the only ways to keep the pain at bay. But Malik's simple, profound act of kindness had pierced straight through that cold armor, reminding him of a humanity he had long since buried. The next morning, Harlan made a decision. He got Malik's address from one of the apprentices and drove there himself. The young man lived in a small, run-down neighborhood, where the tired walls of the houses seemed to sag under the weight of hardship. When Malik opened the door and saw his former boss standing on his doorstep, he froze, bracing himself for more anger or humiliation. But what he saw in the older man's eyes was not rage, but a deep and unmistakable remorse. Mr. Harlan admitted he had been terribly wrong. He apologized, the words coming out with a difficulty that spoke to their sincerity, something he hadn't done in years. He offered Malik his job back, not just as a mechanic, but as the new assistant workshop manager, recognizing that the integrity and compassion the young man possessed were more valuable than any skill with a wrench. Malik was speechless. Tears filled his eyes, and this time he let them fall as he nodded slowly, unable to find the words to respond. When he walked back into the garage later that day, The entire crew gathered around him, breaking into applause and smiles. Mrs. Green was there too, standing proudly in the corner, her hands clasped to her chest as she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. The heavy tension that had once filled the space had vanished, replaced by something warmer, brighter, and more human. Malik picked up his tools and went back to work, his hands once again covered in grease, ready to fix engines, and in his own small way restore a little bit of hope, not just in cars but in the hearts of those who drove them.